In some of our other videos in this course, we discuss the types of analytical functions that are performed within the organization and the various roles that accomplish those functions. In this video, we're going to talk about how analytics teams in general are situated within the larger organization. It turns out that how your organization thinks about analytics can have a big impact on not only the types of analysis you perform, but on the efficiencies of those analytics as well as the speed at which your skills and knowledge can evolve. The material in this video is derived both from our experience in advising companies on how to develop high-performing analytical capabilities, as well as building and leading analytics teams of our own. For the purposes of this discussion, we're really talking about some combination of reporting, ad hoc analytics, and modeling functions, and roles like database analysts, data analysts, modelers, and data scientists, although other roles could be included as well. How analytics teams are structured within an organization tends to hinge upon one basic question: how centralized or decentralized should these organizations be? Should analytics activities be gathered under one team, or should they be embedded within many teams? As you might imagine, the answer depends on a number of different factors. What we'll do here is present 4 different models for analytical organizations that speak to different degrees of centralization. We'll describe each model and outline some of its major pros and cons. To illustrate, we use a visual representation like this. What we have here is one circle in the center that represents functions that are centralized, with a ring of satellite circles that represent non-centralized teams based on the overall organizational structure of the business. These might be areas like marketing or finance in a functionally organized company, or teams aligned to customer groups or lines of business if the company is organized that way. We'll use dark shading to illustrate where analytics functions take place, and we'll show collaboration between the peripheral teams in the center using dotted lines. So let's get started. We'll begin with a fully centralized model, where some set of analytical activities are accomplished using one centralized team. For example, an enterprise analytics team might serve the needs of marketing, finance, operations, customer care, etc., with respect to reporting, ad hoc analysis, and statistical modeling. A centralized model has a few key advantages. First, we can usually achieve a higher level of consistency when analysis is done by a single team, since it's easier to ensure that common methods are used from one analysis to the next. It's also easier to ensure that the priorities of the team, including what analysis is done and when, are aligned with the overall needs of the enterprise versus the needs of only one group. Finally, analysis tends to become very efficient in a centralized team that gets a lot of practice, especially when analytics are less contextual and more procedural. This usually means I get more analytical output out of fewer resources. However, these advantages come at a cost. In a centralized model, the team that executes the analysis is usually not the same team that asks for the analysis. Collaboration is required, and the requesting organization may not get priority over other needs. In this case, the centralized team is less responsive to peripheral organizations, and it's harder for those organizations to control their destinies. A second disadvantage is around context. Someone who sits in marketing and who does marketing all the time is going to have a higher degree of marketing context than an analyst in a centralized organization who may work on a lot of different things. Finally, while the centralized model requires fewer people, it does rely on some consistency in workload. It's harder to fill the plate of a centralized analytical team with non-centralized, non-analytical activities when the workload is light. The second model, called the allocated model, seeks to improve on the responsiveness of the analytical organization while retaining most of the benefits of a centralized approach. In this model, a set of analytical activities is still accomplished using a centralized team, but within that team, specific capacity is reserved for one or more of the peripheral functions. Usually this means that the peripheral organization gets to make prioritization decisions around what work is done and when, up to the limits of their allocated capacity. Some additional capacity is reserved in the centralized team to handle ebbs and flows in peripheral demand or to direct additional effort towards overall enterprise priorities. Again, the main benefit of this approach is improved responsiveness to the organization requesting analysis. It can also have the benefit of improving the context of the analyst group, especially when individuals are allocated to a single function for an extended period of time. At the same time, it's still possible to maintain a good level of consistency in methods, and the team still has some discretion to balance efforts in support of broader priorities. The challenge with the allocated approach is that it can be hard to match the level of allocation desired with the overall needs of the enterprise. Inevitably, some organizations will end up with too much or too little capacity, whether real or perceived. This approach also tends to require a slightly larger resource pool, since we've removed some of the flexibility in how those resources can be deployed. Let's say we take this one step further and actually distribute our analytical resources across functional teams. But we put structures or processes in place to allow some degree of coordination across those teams. What we have in this case is called a coordinated model. In this model, the staffing and priorities of the analytical resources are completely controlled by functional teams. However, these teams are tied together by some set of governance structures, standard methodologies, or communities like users groups or centers of excellence. For example, let's say we had separate analytics teams within marketing, finance, and operations, but those teams regularly convened in a users group and participated in an enterprise-level data governance program. This would be a coordinated model. The benefits of this approach build on those of the allocated model. With full control of resource priority, functional analytics teams can be highly responsive, and since they are integrated into specific functions, a high level of context within those functions can be achieved. At the same time, coordination across teams helps to ensure that there is at least some degree of consistency in methods and approach. However, coordination across teams is notoriously difficult to achieve. It's also much more likely that work will be duplicated across organizations or that different groups will come up with different answers to the same question. You'll hear this described as multiple versions of the truth, which can be a big drain on an organization's effectiveness. Finally, the coordinated approach tends to require more resources than more centralized structures, since each organization staffs to handle its own peaks and workload. The last organizational model we'll discuss is the distributed model, where analytic activities are wholly accomplished within peripheral organizations with little or no coordination. For example, the business and consumer divisions of a large bank might have completely separate analytics teams that work in different locations and on different problems. The advantages of this model are similar to the coordinated model, namely a very high degree of responsiveness and context can be achieved. The team also has complete flexibility in how they accomplish analytics, since they don't necessarily need to adhere to centralized standards. On the downside, there's little guarantee of consistency in methods or even data sources. It's much more likely that efforts may be duplicated, and this approach generally requires the largest number of resources since there are few mechanisms to identify overlap and streamline activities. So which of these models is preferred? Well, it really depends. There are organizations that have found success using each of these models, and even combinations of these models. Rather than ranking the models, why don't we look for some factors that tend to make each model more or less viable in an organization? The most significant factor that influences our organizational model is the size of the company. It turns out that analytical organizations really start performing well when they reach a critical mass of resources. The specific number varies, but it's at least a few analysts. Having multiple perspectives on a team generally encourages knowledge sharing, learning, and development of skills across team members. More senior members can help teach more junior members, and newer members may have new perspectives that complement the knowledge base of more tenured members. The larger an organization is, the easier it is to create multiple teams with critical mass, hence a higher likelihood that less centralized models will work well. It's entirely possible that you'll find yourself as the only analyst on a team. Does this mean you're set up for failure? Not necessarily. It just means you'll need to work harder to find other people to learn from, or you might need to get really good at self-teaching. The second factor influencing organizational design is how different the analytical methods are across an organization. The more similar the methods, the more to be gained from a centralized model where many different resources could be brought together to execute the analysis. If the methods are completely different or require highly specialized knowledge, something more decentralized may work just fine. Depending on the nature of the work, the physical location of an organization's functions can also have a meaningful impact on the viability of the model. When an organization and its functions are centrally located, it's much easier to manage things like responsiveness and collaboration with a centralized team. When organizational groups are geographically distributed, especially at a global scale, it can make more sense to embed some or all analytical functions in those groups via a decentralized design. Even though telepresence technologies make remote collaboration much easier, differences in time zones alone are often enough to push organizations in this direction. The last factor we'll discuss is our old friend context. As we noted earlier, more decentralized models tend to place analysts closer to the business functions they serve and can build a higher degree of context in that area. Depending on how much context and specialization is needed, a decentralized model might be more effective in certain cases. More often than not, when companies grapple with how to set up analytics organizations, it's usually a battle between responsiveness and scale. Most organizations want the efficiencies that some degree of centralization provides, but want to retain the context and control of more decentralized models. For that reason, many companies end up in either the allocated or coordinated structures. Of course, this assumes the company has actually thought through how to best organize for analytics. This may or may not be the case. It's entirely possible and even probable that an organization is failing to reach its potential because of an ineffective structure. This is where you have the opportunity to leverage what we've learned here. As you explore your organization and get familiar with where and how analytics are done, you can assess what's working well and where there might be opportunity. And over time, you can help to influence the way your organization evolves. You probably won't be able to do this on day one, but there are some things you can do that are consistent with the ideas we've covered. Let's say you do find yourself as the lone analyst in a functional team. There's no reason why you couldn't seek out other analysts in other functions and put together an informal knowledge sharing group. The point here is that you can use the same creativity and inquisitive nature that drew you to analytics in the first place to help make your analytics organization the best it can be. Now that you understand the common ways analytics are structured in an organization and what factors drive those structures, you're well prepared to help lead your organization in the right direction.